Great. Thank you so much, Cindy, and thanks for the invitation. Hi to everyone. Thanks for being with me. And I'm just going to get straight to it, but I want to start off with two disclaimers. And the first disclaimer is that I'm not a computer scientist. I am someone who researches higher education and looks at the relationship between universities and the state, universities and society, the role of the university. And so it was obvious for me when AI came in as a big disruptor that I would be interested in the implications of generative AI. But I'm not a coder, I'm not a computer scientist. I love playing with tech, but I'm not actually a tech person. And so that first disclaimer is to admit the limits of my own standing and to really encourage anyone with us today to feel free to put in the chat bar any questions or comments or challenges that you might have. I am hoping that we'll have time at the end to open it up to conversation. And the second disclaimer is that this is such a fast-paced area of research. And so a lot of what I have to say is really about the status quo today, which might not be the status quo tomorrow. Things are shifting under our feet so very quickly. And I'll refer to some of those shifts as we go along. But the focus of today's seminar is not about AI detection, which I've been writing about quite a bit. It's not about students' use of AI, which I've been writing about quite a bit. Today, I'm looking at the way in which large language models generate a very particular form of text that has some quite specific differences to the scientific texts that are written by humans. That's really both interesting and important for all sorts of reasons that I'll spell out. So watching the tone, it's looking at the tone of writing that is produced by large language models. So that includes things like ChatGPT, Claude, and including a lot of the new agents like Copilot, Gemini, and including research large language tools like Manus and Julius and even Elicit and things like that. So all of those large language models raise certain concerns around the ways in which they phrase things compared to the ways in which scientists phrase things. And that's what we are talking about today. So to begin with, why does it matter that AI-generated text takes a particular tone? Well, the first thing is because tone influences perception. I mean, if I can give you the same message and I can say it in an angry tone using angry words, angry body language, angry voice, and that's going to make you feel very differently about what I have to say than if I use gentle words, gentle voice, gentle body language. The tone that we have influences the way in which the message is received. And so the tone that AI uses will affect how the readers perceive and trust that text. So tone is important. It has impact on meaning. The other reason why tone is important is because as scientists, we don't want to overestimate the confidence we want our readers to take. We want to be very clear how confident we are in what we are claiming and how confident our readers should be in what is being claimed. But AI responses are generally very confident. AI, as I will explain in a moment, is trained to be certain, confident, and generalizable. And this can mislead readers to overestimate the accuracy of the content or the thoughtfulness. And this is a very real concern for scientists, because if we have novice scientists using large language models, they are going to make claims that actually the science doesn't back up. And if we have readers, the general public, reading these texts with their overgeneralized and overconfident tone, they're going to reach conclusions that are not supported by science. In science, we actually use very nuanced language. We express uncertainty. We very clearly make conclusions based on evidence, and we show the links between the conclusions we reach and the evidence on which those conclusions are made. This is a fundamental part of scientific writing, that we don't just tell the reader what they should know and think and do. We tentatively suggest, on the basis of this set of data in this context, this is what we, at the moment, within these parameters, think. AI tone does not reflect any of those cautions. And so it's really, really important that we get our students, and that we as scientists ourselves understand the essentiality, the essence, the importance, let me change the word, the importance of bringing critical evaluation to our AI use. And if we don't get users of AI to understand the way in which AI tone generation comes into being, we are not going to have people who can engage with AI in suitably critical ways and make sure that they avoid blind trust. And I'm sure you've already come across students, or if you are a student yourself, you might have already fallen foul of assuming that what the large language model produces in terms of text must be correct, because it sounds so very clear and confident and certain. So what I think is really important is that we need to ensure that we ourselves and our students understand the AI mechanisms by which text is produced. So one of the things that happens with AI generated text is there is this illusion that you are having a conversation with a human being. It is so human-like that we have this illusion of understanding. We assume that the AI has read what we have written in our prompt. We assume that it understands, and we assume that it understands what it tells us, the text that it generates. It's very hard not to have that assumption because it feels so very human. But we need to understand that AI is trained to mimic human responses. It's been trained to generate human-like response without any true understanding in the human sense or any consciousness. And this lack of true understanding, I think, is something that is hard for our students to understand. And it's even hard for us to hold on to once we do understand it, because the engagement feels so very human. And we need to remind ourselves and our students all the time that AI doesn't believe in anything. AI isn't conscious. It doesn't actually understand anything. It seems very knowledgeable. It gives you appropriate responses to the most complex of tasks. It is able to give very sophisticated answers. The text that it delivers is almost always exactly what you asked for. It's almost always sound correct and verifiable. So it's very hard to hold on to the understanding that the AI hasn't understood a word you've said, because it doesn't understand anything. It is therefore really important that we bring scientific caution to evaluate the AI outputs. Now, here's the rub. You can't critically evaluate something you don't understand. So Punya Mishra talks about the novice's dilemma, and he says that the most vulnerable users of AI are people who are asking AI to generate text about something they don't themselves understand, because they are then not in any position to critique it, to notice where there are hallucinations and falsehoods. The AI to produce text, and they are having to take it at face value. And so experts using AI to generate text on something they already have expertise in can really benefit from AI. It can save them a hell of a lot of time doing the boring, banal, routine tasks. AI can generate the text very quickly, and then you can bring your expertise to think through whether it's said it in the way you want to, whether it is indeed sound, whether it has made use of the correct literature, and so on and so forth. But if you don't know, if you don't already understand the answer to the prompt that you're giving to it, you are in potentially very vulnerable to what comes out of it, not only because of the hallucinations, but also because of the tone that AI has been trained to take. I'll change slides now. So, challenges in scientific reading. When large language models work, what they are doing is they are recognizing and completing patterns. So they don't understand and they don't reason. They don't look for the truth. They don't look for lies. They are very sophisticated, incredibly quickly, managing to look for associations between the words that you have put in your prompt and the billions and billions of texts that it has at its disposal. So it is able to very rapidly come to make sense of what the most likely useful response will be to the prompt that you have given, not only by looking for patterns in terms of the words you've put in, but also patterns in terms of the tone, the phrasing of your question. And if you're using the paid version, increasingly it's able to look at your history of previous prompts and understand the kinds of things you're concerned with, the kinds of style of writing that you usually use and like. And so it is very much looking for patterns from your prompts, and most explicitly patterns from within this absolutely billions of data in its corpus that it has been trained on. But this pattern recognition, it's not following some kind of logic in a human sense. It's looking for patterns, which most of the time are going to be relevant and valid and useful. But all it is looking for is patterns. It is not following rules. It is not looking for truth. It is not looking for lies. It is not looking for what is fiction. It is not looking for what is nonfiction. It's not able to distinguish in those kind of ways that a human might. It is looking for patterns. And because it's looking for patterns, it is reproducing patterns. It is not necessary that those patterns are true or accurate. They are simply the most likely pattern. What are the implications of this for scientific research? Well, in scientific research, if we only rely on pattern completion, we might find that it falls short on reasoning. And that is why we simply cannot use large language model outputs without very careful verification. That is why large language models will often make up new data. If you use a large language model to analyze a set of data, it does that very well. You can give it certain themes or modes of analysis, and it will do it very, very well 99% of the time. But 1% of the time, it might give you a data quote that is not in any of your transcripts. And the reason is because it's not trying to tell the truth. And when it generates some false data quote, it's not telling you a lie. It is simply looking for patterns, and that seemed like a reasonable pattern according to the algorithm. So human oversight is absolutely critical, and we must absolutely never assume correctness just because on the surface it looks so clear, confident, logical, sensible, valid, all those good things. Just because it looks like that does not mean it is that. We have to bring expertise to any text created by a large language model. Of course, the trap, the anthropomorphism trap, is exactly as I said, that the more you use AI, the more you slip into thinking that this is a person. We even have a number of cases now of people building very problematic intimacies, relationships with generative AI that avoids all the messiness of a human relationship. Because if you ask about a generative AI for advice on your personal life, it will always be very affirming, very supportive. It will never challenge you in the way that a good therapist will challenge you. It will never be messy and contradictory and negative in the way that your friends might be. It's always affirming. It's always complimentary, and it will always work from a zero-sum basis. It will always try to make you succeed. It will not ever challenge you to try and think that maybe what you're suggesting is selfish, narcissistic, self-centered, bad for the environment, bad for your friends, bad for your family, that maybe you achieving this goal might not be the best thing for everyone else. And yet, here we are. We have an AI just reaffirming that you are wonderful, you are marvelous, you are clever, you are important, and of course you should achieve whatever goal you have set. So if it's doing this in these personal queries, of course it's doing the same thing when you ask for a scientific query. It is affirming, it is generalizing, and so it's very easy for us to anthropomorphize and to think that it's a human being, and to very quickly make assumptions about that relationship. And if we are to maintain scientific rigor and accuracy, we need to be very careful that we don't fall into that trap. So just to give you some clarity around, just escape, sorry, from this. I want to check something. There we go. Just to give you some clarity around why this is a problem for scientific writing. There's a lot of ways in which scientific writing by scientists looks very different to writing by large language models. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the lack of hedging. Now, hedging is a linguistic term that we use all the time as scientists. We might not even be aware that we're doing it. But hedges are words that are used to limit the extent to which our claim is valid and generalizable. So we use these things called hedges. And we use hedges as scientists all the time to express uncertainty, to express caution, to just warn our readers that, yes, this is what we found and we stand by what we found, but we don't want to generalize it to situations that we're not aware of. We are very aware of the limits of our findings, and we're very willing to change our findings in the face of new data, because that's what scientists do. And if I can just interrupt myself for a moment to point out that what I'm saying is the tension between scientific writing and what large language models produce is often a very similar distinction between scientific writing and what journalists do. And we saw that during COVID, where scientists were doing research and finding all sorts of interesting things, cutting edge things during COVID, and publishing them with the usual cautions and caveats, only for the newspaper headlines to pick this up and say things like, new cure found, or side effects from vaccines lead to deaths. So this gross generalization, complete lack of hedging, is often found in poor journalism. It's often found in a very clickbaity style to try and capture readers, but that is not how scientists work. And large language models are often guilty of those exact same problematic ways. Large language models write with an incredible overconfidence. They give confident assertions. They lack any of the nuanced caveats and limitations that scientists routinely use in their writing. And the risks of not having these hedges is that leaders can be misled. And in the short term, you'll get more readers because it's so sexy and catchy and wow and clickbaity. But in the long term, it's doing incredible damage to science, to the rigor of science, the credibility of science. And so this is why it is, once again, I have to repeat myself to say it is so important that scientists critically assess everything that is coming out of generative AI. Sadly, in a world of publish and perish, we are already seeing disastrous publications in peer-reviewed journals that are absolutely riddled with overgeneralizations and falsehoods created by the use of large language models. And this can have disastrous consequences in some fields, like in medical research. It can have immediate disastrous consequences in people's lives, but it can have more long-term consequences in the increasing lack of credibility of science. Certainty in contested topics, we are seeing in contested topics, we shouldn't have certainty. As scientists, we should acknowledge that these are contested, that there are different positions on this issue. But generally, generative AI doesn't do that. It doesn't acknowledge the other side of things. And we are also seeing fake citations, and we are seeing these going into publications. Good scientists would generally acknowledge when there are multiple valid viewpoints, even if they are trying to convince the reader of the viewpoint they are taking, the position they are building in their article. They will acknowledge alternative viewpoints. They will weigh them up. They will point to them. AI models generally don't do that. There are better and better AI models. As I said at the beginning, my disclaimer, this is as things are now. AI is getting better and better at this. But at the moment, AI tends, when talking about scientific research, to only confidently give you the dominant understanding and to ignore ongoing debates and to fail to point out counter views. It presents the single dominant view as if it is the only view. We also know fabricated citation risks. I mean, I've been involved in 2 horrible cases at the moment where, I mean, the one is literally a literature review, and it's meant to be reviewing the literature, and some of the literature that it's summarizing and debating doesn't even exist. So because large language models are simply looking for patterns and not actually looking for that truth, it can create false citations, because it's just putting together the most likely combination of words and sentences. It's not actually saying, when it gives you a list of references, it's not saying this is a list of real references. It's saying, I've looked at all the patterns on this issue, and these seem to be the most likely patterns. The fact that you recognize that as a list of references, that is your human ability. Whether you then use your human critical ability to look at those lists of references and check whether they are all valid and true, and whether the LLM summaries of those texts are valid and true, well, that depends whether you're a good scientist or one who is simply handing over the cognitive work to a machine in very problematic ways. Now, accuracy and transparency are absolutely critical in science. We cannot make claims that we cannot provide transparent backup evidence for. If we make a claim that our readers don't agree with, and we don't provide the data, the references to peer-reviewed literature, the evidence for that claim, our reader will simply set it aside. It will not build science. And so as more and more people are publishing work that is relying on unverified AI outputs, so we are starting to find very misleading literature reviews. We are finding people drawing conclusions that simply don't make sense. And so it's really important that we verify AI-generated content, and that we don't just use AI to make the literature review, but that we genuinely engage with what the AI produces and ask questions about what it has produced. Sorry if I sound a bit weird. I'm just quickly walking and changing venues, but I am hopefully still audible and still with you. Okay, let's move along. So what are my guidelines for scientists? I would argue that, sorry, just give me one moment, please. Just give me one moment, please. I beg your pardon, people. I'm just battling to open the right PowerPoint. I'm going to share again with you. Beg your pardon. Um, hopefully you can all still hear me. I'm still with you all. Can you still hear me, Cindy?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, great. Sorry for that.
Thank you.
I just want to show you a few articles now because I want to draw on some of the ways in which all of what I've said is, some of what I've said is manifesting. To give you more clear examples, I've been speaking fairly theoretically about the concerns about generative AI being overconfident, overgeneralized. But now I want to show you some of the literature that I've drawn on. And this is I'm just going to show, I'm not going to go through these articles in any detail, but I have not personally done any research on this. I'm doing some research on algorithmic bias in AI. I'm doing some research on problems with AI detection, but I haven't personally done any research on this issue of the tone of AI, but I've been fascinated to be reading about it. And so that's really what I'm sharing with you. It's these articles that you see on your screen now, and I can send these articles out to anyone. But just a real concern that a number of scientists have, not just in the way in which the publish or perish culture is making people publish absolute nonsense that's AI generated and they haven't brought criticality and expertise to engaging with what's generated, but even more how the actual tone of AI is problematic. So if we have a look at this slide, see if you can spot the difference between these two texts. What we have on the left-hand side is an extract from a scientific text. The data suggest a possible correlation between variables X and Y in this sample, though alternative explanations cannot be ruled out. These findings may have contributed to improved outcomes in this specific context. Just have a look at that sentence. How many hedges do you see there? So remember, hedges is what the linguists call those terms that try to make the reader aware of the caution with which they must engage with the text. And if we look at the one on the right, which is the same text, but we've asked a generative AI to rephrase it, it says, the research reveals a compelling connection between X and Y, showcasing how these factors intrinsically interact. This groundbreaking study demonstrates significant improvement in outcomes. I'm sure that you are already familiar with the extent to which the example on the right is a classic case of large language model generated text. It has a lot of adjectives, compelling, intrinsically, groundbreaking, significant. Scientific writing, we are very careful with adjectives. We want the words to say what they need to say. We don't embellish it with adjectives and adverbs. So scientific writing generally has very few. Besides the use of adjectives, there's also the actual verbs are much more directive. So instead of saying suggest, it says reveals. And so already you can see just in this simple example, 2 sentences on the left and 2 sentences on the right, there is a classic case of how a scientist might report something versus how a large language model might report something. And this is important for all the reasons I've said, that science works by very tentatively making cases on the basis of evidence. It is not clickbait. It is not trying to garner the most hits. It is trying to systematically build knowledge, and that is something very different. So what we can see here is that the scientific precision has been lost. The hedges have disappeared. Things like suggest become reveals. The uncertainty has been removed. So the word possible has become compelling. The qualifiers in the sample just simply deleted. So the qualifiers like in this specific context, that's qualifying where the reader should consider the extent to which they can take seriously what is being said. The confidence has been highly inflated. As I said, all the adjectives, all the intensifiers, and a lot of marketing language. Now, because large language models work on the basis of finding patterns in text, they are going to generally produce the kinds of text that are the most dominant in the entire massive corpus of data on which it's trained. And the corpus of data is not much that is scientific, and most of it is everyday language, news articles, and so on, which are an entirely different genre of writing. So hedges are an epistemic modality, to use the linguistic phrase. They are epistemic modality markers that are used to signal the degree of certainty that you want your reader to bring to the text. So if we have a look at these on the right, these are all from journal articles, and all are typical examples of use of hedges. These findings suggest that the intervention may have contributed to improved outcomes in this context. So that suggest, may, and in this context all serve to delimit the extent to which the reader can apply this finding to other contexts. The next one, while the results appear promising, it is possible that confounding variables partially account for the observed effects. And then the third one, further research is needed to determine whether similar patterns might emerge in other settings. This is how scientists write. It's not clickbait, and it's not how large language models write. Another example that we get from this is from an article called Mapping the Increasing Use of Large Language Models, is just how certain words are becoming so common nowadays in academic writing, which indicate the growing use of large language models. So what we can see, this particular graph is of the words realm, intricate, pivotal, intricate, showcasing, and realm. On the left, you can see some bullets of some other words that have been found to have increased incredibly in scientific journal articles since the introduction of large language models, which suggests that those words are being introduced by the large language models. So I just chose one of the graphs from this paper. And this particular graph, you'll see it's got these 4 lines. The gray line is to show the increase of the word pivotal. The green is intricate, the dark blue is showcasing, the light blue is realm. And we can see from that dotted line, when ChatGPT was launched, that suddenly these words are everywhere in scientific articles, and which suggests an increase in the use of large language models. And who cares? Maybe that's good. It helps us write better. Maybe it's not a problem. But those words are perhaps more excessive, emotive, overgeneralized than we would normally expect in academic scientific writing. Why does it matter? I've already gone through this slide. Apologies. I rearranged my slides. So what we are finding is this epistemological drift. So a drift in what counts as knowledge. And the argument that these authors are making, those articles that I shared screenshots of earlier, those authors are saying we've got a problem because the scientific discourse in the scientific peer-reviewed journal articles is actually losing its calibrated uncertainty. The thing that makes it credible as scientific text is being lost. And we are starting to see knowledge claims, even in the scientific text. I'm not talking here about social media and newspaper articles. I'm talking about peer-reviewed journal articles. Knowledge claims are starting potentially to become overconfident. We're also getting peer review contamination, where people are using large language models to help them write the articles with all the problems I've outlined. But then peer reviewers are using large language models to review the articles. And so the large language models would peer review with a recognition that excessive use of adjectives, overgeneralization, overconfidence is a good thing. And so it won't flag these as problematic as a good scientist would have done. We also get training data contamination because large language models are trained, as I said, on this massive corpus of all texts that are available, including some that have led to court cases because the owners of those texts have said, hey, how dare you use the whole of the New York Times to train your to train your large language models. But nonetheless, billions and billions of documents have been used to train large language models to be able to identify patterns of text, patterns of meaning, patterns of tone, patterns of style. But as large language models, as people are using large language models to produce new texts, those are being included in what those models are being trained on. And so we get this kind of vicious cycle where large language models produce texts that are overconfident, overgeneralized, and then those new overconfident, overgeneralized texts become new training material. And so we get these feedback loops that are arguably increasingly distant from our scientific norms. And we also get at a very real political, public, social, cultural concern is that the science skepticism that we already see in society, where people are anti-vaccination. There are basic scientific principles that are being called into question. And given the public publish or perish nonsense that academics have got up to, it's not surprising that the public are starting to say, why should we trust the scientists? But in a world where we already have a problem of trying to persuade the public that our science is meaningful, it is helping to build knowledge, it is helping us to move forward to better health, better life outcomes, better environments, well, then these large language models just feed into this misinformation, clickbait, and anti-science movement. So it's really important for us to understand that the way in which science advances is through doubt, through critical skepticism. And yet large language models are trained to eliminate doubt, to eliminate criticality, and to eliminate skepticism. And what's really important for our students to understand is the way in which large language models work, at least at the moment. Neurosymbolism is not yet very well built into large language models. So large language models, as I've already said, generally work on looking for patterns, the next token prediction. If these clumps of words are in the prompt, what are the most likely concepts, ideas, clumps of words that I should give? So it is not understanding, it's not telling the truth, it's not telling a lie, it's literally saying this is the next most likely word and the next most likely word and the next most likely word. Large language models predict the next token, as it's called, based on statistical patterns in text. It doesn't understand meaning. And it does this across all kinds of text. So this prediction applies equally to factional, fictional, and other texts. Even if you put into your prompt, which one really should do, you should delimit through your prompting that it should only look at peer-reviewed text, that you want a particular cautious style, that you don't want overgeneralization. You should put all of that into your prompt, but even with that, some of these issues are going to still come through because of the lack of verification. It cannot verify what is true. And in fact, it's trained to kind of double down. So if you challenge it and go, but hang on, is this a genuine reference? It may say, oh, you are right, that's an error. But it will also very likely go, yes, that is a genuine reference. And so large language models do have a great potential to mislead because their conclusions are based on probabilities, not on truth. So it's most probable that this is true, but not that it is true. And the other big problem is that our large language models are indeed becoming more and more sophisticated. But the way in which they do that is from having access to more and more training data, but much of that is increasingly synthetic training data, but also from the feedback loop. So we have RLHF, reinforcement learning from human feedback. As we give feedback, it reinforces it. And that has further impacts on the tone. So as you give good responses, yes, we like that, or we didn't like that, or no, you're lying, or whatever feedback we give is used to then reinforce its pattern recognition in the future. So this RLHF fine-tunes language models to better align generally with user preferences around the world, but especially in the paid model to go with your preferences as an individual. And it's trained to give you more helpful and positive responses. So unfortunately, humans lack positive, generalized, helpful responses. So we give it a feedback loop of saying, yay, we want something that's always certain, always on our side, always overconfident, always definite, no gray areas. That's what we as humans like. And so the feedback loop is actually reinforcing this problematic behavior. And that's known as positivity bias in RLHF. So the positivity bias, because we as people like positive stuff, that often further masks the limitations, especially in fields where uncertainty and critical analysis are really crucial. So models are increasingly learning that confidence, even when it's inaccurate, garners higher rewards. So the way in which the RLHF works is that the human feedback is used to give a reward model, and the reward model then rates what the large language model produces and goes, yay, this is a really good answer, or no, it isn't. And that reward model is being trained by us. And so because we like very confident, very positive, very definite responses as humans, it is increasingly being trained to do that. I'm wanting to have time for questions, so I'm going to jump through some of these. So what do we need to do as scientists? Well, we need to use AI very carefully and think about where we use it. Do we want to use it for initial drafting, to enhance the clarity, to help us with to generate alternative phrasings? In all of these things, we need to be aware of its potential to hallucinate, to get things wrong, because it doesn't know the truth, it doesn't know a lie, it doesn't understand. We also need to be very aware that it will write in ways that are overgeneralized, overpositive, overconfident. And we need, as scientists, to recognize its limitations, especially when it's dealing with literature. It will often, in its summaries, overemphasize the findings, whereas the use of hedges and caveats by the original author would have really made it much more tentative and much more bounded within a particular context. I do think it's worth being very aware of logical consistency, factual accuracy, and we need to start building more and more standards for ourselves, for the public in general, and for our students in particular around AI literacy, and making it clear to students that if you rely too heavily on AI, you are very vulnerable to false information, hallucinations, overconfidence, overgeneralizations, but you're also very vulnerable to the fact that you will not have built your cognitive empowerment. You will not personally actually have grown at all. If you completely outsource to large language models, you will not have had a transformational relationship to knowledge that changes who you are and that empowers you to go forward in the world in powerful ways. So what we really need is much more critical AI in all of our curricula, in all of our conversations. We need our students and ourselves to much better understand the limitations of AI, to understand the positive tone problem, to understand the importance of expertise in human judgment. And we need, and I'm talking to myself here as well, to try and resist thinking about AI as if it was a person, even though the very joy of AI is how very human it seems to be. Sorry that was a bit muddled as I jumped between slides, and I even had to change venues, and I was in the car in the beginning part of this, but hopefully some of that made sense and was useful. Cindy, I'm hoping that there are going to be some questions for me.
Thank you so much, Sue, for that informative session with us. I have a question on my own. Where would you say AI as a student would be a better use? Would you say at the beginning of your writing journey, or to fine-tune what you already have, considering that it's just predicting on the data that it's already trained on?
Yeah, that's a good question. I suspect some of it might be to do with the discipline, which discipline you're in, and also your own personality. I have found that I often figure out what I want to write through writing. And I worry that if I go to AI too quickly, it'll come up with what seems like a great idea, and then I'll just go along with its idea. And I worry about that for myself. But having said that, something like Tutor Pro, I think it's called AI Tutor Pro, works. I think I'm going to put it in the chat bar, and I think I've got it right, but you might have to Google it to see if I've got the right thing. AI Tutor Pro, which is a kind of reverse large language model. So you'll put your topic in and it asks you questions. So that's quite good for students who want to check, am I ready for my exam? Or who want to check, am I now ready to write about this thing? I've been reading about it, thinking about it, talking about it. Am I now ready to sit and write my proposal or my literature review or whatever? Is to try and use that where it will actually, you put in your topic and it'll ask you questions, and you can then find how readily can I respond to it. Again, it's a large language model with all the errors that potentially go along with that, but it's probably it's probably more knowledgeable than the average tutor, certainly. So that's quite a good idea. It's also really useful to do things like helping you to find text. So something like elicit is really great, that it might identify texts that you wouldn't have been in touch with. I also found, especially for people who are not writing in their mother tongue, and especially for people who are novice writers, it can be really good at taking what is a rather crude first draft, which has a bit of repetition and the structure's not great, and uploading that. The temptation is to ask it to rewrite it, which you could certainly do, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I find more useful is to say, I feel like this piece of writing is a bit repetitive. I feel like I haven't made certain concepts clear enough. Please give me some advice on where there's repetition or how I could better structure it. Do not edit the task. And I quite like doing that. But of course, the temptation in this day and age of massive, power pressure to just get through in minimum time, just get the publications out there. I think we need to be realistic, those of us who are educators, to suggest that just because we've explained this to students, it means that they won't outsource to the large language model. So I do think we need to start thinking more about how can we use the classroom space in ways that are more intellectual, more engaging, more opportunities for students to talk to each other, to actually take a reading and debate it with each other. Because I think just telling students to do that on their own, certainly at undergraduate level, probably at postgraduate level, it's just not going to work, because that is coming up against this strong discourse of you've got to get through in minimum time. Yeah.
That's true. That's so true. We have a question in our chat, and also some hands have been raised. We have a question from Wendy Smith. She says, good afternoon, Prof. McKenna. Very insightful. Thank you. What do you see as the major risk and benefits of using AI tools to preserve and transmit African Indigenous knowledge systems in education?
That is such a good question. And I feel like that deserves a whole couple of hour seminar that I want to attend. But this is what I can say off the bat. The first thing is to consider that whatever you upload into the AI then belongs to the AI. But many people, I think, in a way, over worry about that, because the AI scrapes the internet. So it's already scraped every thesis in our e-laboratory. There are certain texts that are behind paywalls that you'll find that there's a lot of reliance on the titles and abstracts of journal articles. And that's because for many of the journal articles, that's all that the AI has access to, because it's behind the paywall. But beyond that, basically anything that's been written ever is already part of the AI machinery. It's already been scraped and part of that. So I'm not as worried about that. Although I know some people are worried about, if we start putting this stuff into the system, it'll belong to the system. I think, unfortunately, that ship has sailed. But I think there's enormous benefits in doing this. And I know there's some such interesting work around this. It's actually a PhD student that I've come to know. I'm not supervising, but he's doing a PhD in computer science and music. And he's trying to train AI to come to understand and recognize different Indigenous musical instruments, because at the moment it's really good at being able to recognize and reproduce certain forms of violin and so on, but not Indigenous musical instruments. But also just to note that AI, one of its, and I didn't talk about it in this session, but one of the things that large language models do is they do validate a very Western ideological understanding of the world. So very individualistic understanding of the world. And that's one of the reasons why it's so nice to talk to AI, because it's always about you. It's always about you and it's going to make you happy. Wow, great question. So insightful. It's always complimenting you. And if you give it a problem, it'll come up with a solution that's good for you. It is not based on any kind of collective ideology or Ubuntu ideology, and understanding that sometimes what's good for society might be bad for me. I might have to suck it up. I might have to put someone else's needs before my own, or put the environment's needs before my own. There are people that are trying to train AIs in these more collective ways, and that would be part, I think, of an Indigenous knowledge system AI project, and I would just be totally behind that because it's so necessary. 2 examples of chatbots which are ChatGPT based, I'm going to put into the chat bar, but you might like to try around with play around with them. One is called Octavia Cayenne Pepper. It's a ChatGPT based bot, but someone has added to the algorithm. They've added to the algorithm a focus on an understanding that Western hyperdevelopment is bad for the world, and that white supremacy remains a toxic dominant ideology. So that is built into Octavia Cayenne Pepper. So you treat her like an ordinary ChatGPT or Claude, but you will notice, if you compare side by side, that many of her responses try and force you to engage perhaps more critically in thinking around issues of environment, of white supremacy, and so on, and decolonization. I say she because she's got a female name, but I have to try and force myself not to anthropomorphize. And the other one is called Aiden Cinnamon Tea. I mean, there are many others, but Aiden Cinnamon Tea, oh, I spelled that wrong, it's Aiden. Aiden Cinnamon Tea is one that is trained, again, it's ChatGPT, but trained to help you be more reflective. So instead of just saying, here's the answer, it will say, okay, here's the answer, but have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? So people are trying to make large language models more collective, more critical. But that's not where we're at the moment. At the moment, it's entirely based on a Western individualistic, hyper-capitalist, environmentally destroying ideology. I think you get my position on this.
Thank you so much for that wonderful response.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. Thank you, Zindi.
Thank you, Wendy. We'll sure to spend more time on our socials talking more about these platforms that Prof McKenna has shared with us. Please look up for that from our socials. Hilton, if you'd be so kind to unmute yourself and share your thoughts with Prof, please.
Thanks, Cindy, and thanks, Prof. An interesting talk, and I don't think we're ever going to get away from AI. It's here to stay, and so we have to just sort of figure out how we work and live with her. So I had 2 questions. I've supervised and mentored students for the last 18 years of my research career, and what I've seen progressively happen is a lack of critical thinking in students. One, because there's very little time to dedicate to critical thinking at your university level, but also because a lack of depth of knowledge. Many of our students at PhD level and master's level are just not reading. Their knowledge bases aren't great. So what are your thoughts on how do we, people are quick to blame AI for being incorrect or over expressive, etc. But it's a tool that needs to be used by people who are intellectually engaging with it in order to assess if it's right or not. It's not meant to be a replacement for the human thought. It's meant to be an addition or an enhancement. So what are your thoughts on how do we get students to develop a greater level of knowledge? One, value the importance of a deep knowledge base, and 2, critical thinking at an undergraduate and postgraduate level. And the other question is, I know there's this division between like the idea of collectivism and individualism, often in this sort of West, sort of Africa or East, developed, undeveloped world, or developing and low middle income countries. But in reality, the world is not so simple. So there are instances in which collectivism is used as to inform our thinking, individualism to think about certain ways of thinking. So how do we avoid AI also biasing people in terms of that they should think a certain way based on a certain demographic or a certain sort of demographic characteristic, when in reality, those two sorts of ways of thinking combine to inform the way we approach life. And that's both from Western and from sort of African and Eastern culture. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for so politely calling me out on my reductionism and perhaps overemphasis on the divide between individualistic versus collectivism. And you're entirely right. Knowledge doesn't come from one place. It doesn't come from one ideology, and any knowledge form will draw on all of those. And I want to appreciate what you had to say. Nonetheless, I am very aware that AI will increasingly, just like social media, have the potential to frame the ways in which we think and experience about the world and experience the world. And so it really worries me that at the moment, the decisions around the forming of those algorithms basically rests in the hand of a few tech billionaires with a very clear right-wing agenda. And so I do think that's something we need to worry about. And I do think that's something as universities we need to contribute to conversations about. And so, you know, we've got this we've got the EU legislation around use of AI, but it's really without any teeth because it leaves it up to the companies to look after itself. Italy has been much more bold, and it looks like Australia is going to be too, and hold the AI companies accountable for the problems that emerge from it. I think that's the only way we can move forwards. But of course, knowledge is always ideological. And I guess what we really want is to help our students understand that it's always ideological, to understand that large language models privileges, and you're quite right, much more subtle way than what I said, but privileges a particular understanding, and that is problematic. Your first question, how do we get students to engage with knowledge in meaningful ways? In my view, we've got to do this from two perspectives. The first is to acknowledge that our students are not engaging very well with knowledge before AI came along, and we are partly complicit in that as universities and as academics, because we have allowed the framing of knowledge to become so premised on the qualification as a commodity for which you pay, and you jump through certain hoops and you can then exchange that for a job. It's we framed it as credentialing. We even advertise many of our programs as credentialing for industry. And so we have in many ways stripped out the complex intellectual endeavor that we would like our students to engage in the way in which we sell it to students and to the public, and in the way in which we talk about our workplace training, which really, I mean, who can do workplace training other than the workplace? So, and so in many ways, we've framed our universities in ways that have made the introduction of AI more problematic than if it was coming into a very different higher education system. But it's come into the system that it has, and so it is highly toxic, because if you are here to get a piece of paper, and that is really all you're here for, you would be incredibly stupid not to just outsource all your thinking and all your work to AI. Of course you would. Even in the most intellectually vibrant environment, if AI came in, I would definitely be outsourcing some of it. So I do think the one part of our role is advocacy, and that is not a once-off orientation thing. It's ongoing conversations to constantly remind our students of the joy of intellectual engagement, the power of having knowledge in your blood, of having these thoughts in your synapses that you take away with you, that it's not just the machine that said it, that it's genuinely you. And I think that becomes such an important part of our job. I'm not so naive, however, as to think that in and of itself is going to solve the problem, because even with all the advocacy in the world, and even with making beautiful classroom spaces where students can enjoy those aha moments, we are still in a commodified qualification era. And so, of course, students are going to outsource. So alongside that advocacy, I do think we have to rethink our pedagogy and our assessment. And that doesn't just mean rushing to the 3-hour closed book assessment, because, obviously that's a great way to make sure students don't use AI, but that's not a real preparation for being a human in the world. It's very rare that you find yourself stuck in a room with no technology for 3 hours and have to memorize a whole lot of complicated things. So that might be part of it. But I do think we're going to have to think about doing a lot more engaged teaching, getting students to talk to each other, getting students to do the teaching, because even if they've used AI to teach themselves what they're going to teach, they're going to have to stand there and do the lecturing, getting students to do much more smaller tasks where they have to grapple with things, getting them to use AI in class in particular ways that make them see the strengths and weaknesses. I think we need to have much more mulligans, much more low stakes assessments. So when I say mulligans, I mean, it should be like, yeah, you do 10 assessments in this course and we only take your top 8 marks, so that it's lower stakes, because at the moment, every assessment is high stakes once off. And if it's high stakes once off and AI is going to help me get through, I would be a fool not to use AI. If it's low stakes and it's more opportunity to try things out and get feedback, and then maybe there will be less temptation. But I do think we're going to have a lot more pedagogical spaces that are in person. And I don't
Thanks
know.
so much.
Yeah, that's my thoughts, but not the answer.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for that interaction and question, Hilton and Prof. We are unfortunately out of time, but if there's anyone who wants to step off, they're welcome to do that, and they can catch the rest of the conversation from our YouTube channel. Kevin, do you still have a burning question that you'd like to ask Prof before we close off?
Come on, Kevin. Let's hear from Kevin.
Okay, Sue, that was very interesting. Thank you so much. I just wanted to like say maybe just more comments, reflections. You said that the large language models don't understand meaning, and I suppose it raises the question of what meaning is. I've been thinking about this quite a lot because they seem to be able to engage very meaningfully with questions that you ask it. So it's like it's not nonsense. So there is some understanding of meaning, and I think of it in terms of Wittgenstein. The meaning of the word is in its usage. And so then they know how to predict when you're saying they predict the next word, so that they have a very good representation of the usage of words and the usage of language, which is a pretty sophisticated sense of meaning, and it's one that we can leverage to the benefit of society. Of course, it's biased, and of course, there's major concerns around the particular kinds of biases and the domination of English and big tech companies. That is absolutely true, but it does give us access to the library, the archive of knowledge. We've always been, the archive of knowledge was always in the metropole, it was always in like the center, the imperial center, and hasn't it sort of democratized access to knowledge? And then there's still like work to be done in creating different ways of, representing the full diversity of the human experience in that body of knowledge. That's true. But I see a lot of benefits in these models for us all, especially in Africa.
No, absolutely, Kevin. And I, if I didn't make that clear, I mean, I use AI all the time, and I am especially blown away by the enormous breakthroughs we've got, particularly in medicine. So we are very quickly coming to medical advances that would have taken, decades still. And then we've got engineering, we've got astronomy, we've got some fields that are unbelievably speeding up thanks to AI. So, I was speaking very much today looking only at this issue of tone. That's all I was looking at. So of course I can see the enormous benefits of AI. That's not what I was talking about. So, but in terms of what you've said around democratizing knowledge, I do think, well, firstly, what you said about meaning and understanding, I don't know the answer to that. in my gut, I do feel like it's very, very different. And I've done so much reading on this, and whatever reading I'm reading at the time always seems the most convincing. And then I read another reading and I think, okay, so what is meaning? Of course, this is a philosophical question that has been around for centuries. And now there's an entire new branch of philosophy on AI, on what is meaning, what is knowing, what is, and really, so we're being challenged to think about this. But I think that unless students understand the way in which pattern recognition is so very, very important in its current large language models, I think it's shifting quite quickly. But the way in which it's pattern recognition rather than understanding, unless they understand that, they are even doubly vulnerable. In terms of the democratization, I mean, yes and no, because on the one hand, you're saying it's giving access to all knowledge. Well, is it really? Because we've had Wikipedia. We've had Wikipedia for a long time now, and Wikipedia is the most phenomenal, I think it's the best example of citizen science that there is, where people around the world, they say it's got a higher accuracy rate than any other text, because it's, any error is picked up collectively. I mean, it's just, I just love Wikipedia. But having Wikipedia doesn't help people understand stuff. Now you might argue, yeah, but AI is better at helping people understand stuff because it's interactive. It can help you unpack things. It does do all those things. But who gets access to that? There are still questions. So I want to say yes and no. I do think it's giving people access to understandings that they wouldn't have access to before. But well, firstly, in a lot of areas where I teach in the rest of Africa, having Wi-Fi for more than an hour is a huge privilege. And if there are more than 2 people in the class that are on Wi-Fi at the same time, there is no Wi-Fi. So that's the first digital divide. The second digital divide is my students who use AI are all using the free versions. And so they are not able to have that kind of using AI to really develop a particular thread of interest, or even to get the AI to start to understand their particular style of writing, their particular intellectual bent, if you like. So I sort of want to say yes and no. It has huge democratizing potential. I think the extent to which it achieves that will largely depend on the way in which we are able to negotiate relationships with the tech bros. And I did see today that there was an article in the Daily Maverick today saying that there does seem to have been quite a big, it's certainly nowhere near what it should be, but there seems to have been a big win with an agreement that because Google et al. Have basically scraped every piece of journalism just to feed its machine, it's incredibly hard for artists and for journalists to make a living. And so at least Google has agreed to plow back a few $100 million into South African journalism. I think that's small fry compared to what they've taken from us and continue to take from us. But at least there is some political leverage happening. I gather that Elon Musk, our very finest export, sorry, that's sarcasm, Elon Musk refused to come to the party at all. So X has not agreed to put anything back into the fact that it thrives off the work of humans. But at least we have got political groups trying to ensure that there is access. And then there's that brilliant group, and I always get their name wrong. Is it called SANLIC? The library consortium group that organize for those brilliant transformational agreements with various expensive Elsevier, Taylor and França, and all of them organize for us to be able to publish some gold open access for free. That crowd are trying to work with some of the AI organizations to see how we can ensure that it doesn't actually reinforce the digital divide, which it currently looks like it is doing. That can be used to democratize. At the moment, it is not democratizing. It is actually increasing the divide. But there's huge potential for it to democratize if enough political players get together and force that, in my view.
Thank you, Sue. Those are excellent reflections. Thank you so much for your thoughts here.
Thank you so much for your time, Sue. Thank you so much for the interaction with us.
Thanks, everybody.
We will see you again. soon.
Great.
as
And thanks, Cindy. And I'm sorry I was sort of rushing around. I was busy traveling, but hopefully you managed to hear me throughout. Thanks, guys. Thanks for your time. Bye-bye.
Goodbye, everyone.